I'm Alexis Madrigal. I'm a senior editor at The Atlantic, and I'm going to be your moderator today. I have to tell you that I am incredibly excited about this panel. I have, for the last 2 days, been thinking about having these three people up here and giddy like a child. So before I even introduce what the panel is going to be about, I'm actually going to introduce the people. First we have, to my left here, we have Alexis Ohanian, who co-founded the social network Reddit, which now has over 70 million users a month who spend an absurd amount of time on the site. Since shortly after Condé Nast purchased Reddit, Alexis has been mostly sitting on the beach, I think. Actually, he's been doing a lot of work doing lobbying on issues important to internet entrepreneurs and users of the internet, things on SOPA and PIPA. And he also, I found out, is working on a book called Without Their Permission that has a subtitle.
Yes, it's a manifesto for entrepreneurship in the internet age.
That's right, correct. And I would also like to note that this is probably an Aspen first, that there are two male Alexises on the same stage. Which is highly unusual, I will tell you.
Very exciting.
Proving that our parents did not know who Joan Collins was on the show Dynasty.
Yeah. Mom's foreign.
We have Kurt Andersen down at the end, has done so many things that I'm not going to run through all of them. Right now he's the host of Studio 360, Peabody Award-winning show from PRI and WNYC. He's also a novelist. His most recent book is True Believers, which you should go buy in the bookstore. Got great reviews from people like the Washington Post, Ron Charles. He also co-founded one of the coolest magazines in the history of magazines, which was called Spy, along with Graydon Carter, who's now the editor of Vanity Fair. And last, in the middle, we have Ezra Klein, the man who made the term wonk sexy, I think I would say. He runs the wonk blog at the Washington Post. He's a columnist there as well as at Bloomberg, and he appears regularly on MSNBC. So I think any debate about the future of news, which is what this panel is about, should probably begin with the past. And I think the sort of canonical narrative that exists is that newspapers were actually wonderful and awesome up through maybe about 10 years ago. And they produced necessary, very important journalism all the time, and that there were very few problems with the way that they worked. And certainly, I've spent some time with, say, Mark Bowden, the guy who wrote Black Hawk Down, who was at the Philadelphia Inquirer in the 1970s. And when you talk to him and he tells you he had months to work on stories and they had all these fact checkers and they had all of these wonderful resources that they could deploy to tell important stories, you start to think, wow, this system of producing news was really good. On the other hand, I've spent time at Berkeley in the Office for the History of Science and Technology, so I spent a lot of time reading old newspapers. And on a sort of story-by-story basis, one thing you discover is that news reporting was incredibly uneven. And in fact, in many cases, it was quite bad. And it really came home for me reading about 3 Mile Island in newspaper coverage at the time. And if you go back and you compare what was written to sort of the narratives that came out afterwards from historians, people who had more time, just about everything was wrong that came out in newspapers of the time. And if those stories were to come out today, it would be seen as proof of the evilness of internet media and what's happened to journalism. But of course, it was March 1979. My point is just that reporting news is really hard, and the solutions that people have come up with are not always obvious. So I think the real history of newspapers and news more generally is much more confusing and confused than what we've heard. I mean, every paper was kind of an experiment, which meant that the Columbian near my hometown of Ridgefield, Washington, might have only had 7 original articles a day, and the rest of it was just pulled from wires and sports reporting on my high school football team. And yet, I do think that in the last half of the 20th century, we did develop a kind of culture of journalism and ethics that had some really excellent components around sourcing, around the relationship that we had with the government. And it really took root, and we became important and maybe less good, became self-important in the way that we interacted with the culture more broadly. So I think there's a tradition, actually, of journalism ethics that I actually love, and I think most of the people up here love too. And I think the kind of big question for today and the big question for this panel is what parts of that culture we can preserve as we go through this incredibly wild changes in journalism right now to our business models, the way that we think about authority, the rise of social media, and all the other changes that we've seen over the last decade. So last thing before I turn it over to these guys, I want to just tell you how this panel is going to go. We're going to run through some questions, probably for about the first 30 minutes up here. And then, because if we know one thing about the future of news, it's that it's more interactive. We're going to throw to you very early in the session. And then we're going to come back at the very end for about 10 minutes of a lightning round where we're actually going to try and pin these guys down on real predictions about the future of media. So first question, guys, and maybe we'll start with Kurt and come this way. How do you personally get your news? Like, what's your media diet now?
I atavistically still get paper copies of the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times on my doorstep.
Do you read them?
Of course, no, I let them sit there. Yes, I read them, and
lots of people do.
And so I get, and then through the day, mostly the New York Times on a device as I'm walking around and on the subway, and then I would say the great bulk of my news diet on a daily basis, apart from that, are from the smart people I follow, like Ezra, like you, who are leading me to things that I might or might not have seen otherwise. So it's, conventional, enhanced and supplemented by social media, pointers.
How about television?
I watch my friends who are on television. I have, to tell you the truth, I have. In terms of daily news, since I was a child, I really haven't gotten much from the television. Which isn't to say that there aren't worthy things on television, but and when smart people are yelling at each other on the cable news shows, which is rare, I enjoy that. But only up, it's like eating chocolate or something. That's a bad example because chocolate is good. It's like eating something that is like barbecued potato chips. You just don't want to do that much. It's tasty for a short while. And so yeah, I watch Fox News and MSNBC and not so much CNN.
Got it.
You and I need to have a conversation about barbecued potato chips later. Just bracketing that. All right, my news diet is going to sound like one long self-promotional string. So I will attempt at the end to say something to make people mad to counterbalance it. In the morning, I edit something called Wonk Book, which is a daily morning email in which me and this guy, Evan Soltis, who is this insanely brilliant Princeton freshman, who I found because as a senior in high school, he was running an exceedingly good monetary policy blog. This is the kind of person I would like to get to know. So we pull together a bunch of policy news from all the major papers. We pull together from a lot of websites. We have typically, I'd guess, 50 or 60 or 70 stories in there. And so I edit through that and I click through all the stories I want to read. And that's the bulk of how I get, I'd say, my sort of big reported mainstream media diet. It's through editing that, which is coming from a lot of different sources. You can all subscribe to Wonk Book for free. Then throughout the day, I used to do a lot more, I think outside of reading, I used to read a lot more blogs, and I could name folks I really like, but now I actually find, and possibly other people do too, that because I'm editing a lot of copy coming through the Washington Post and coming through Wonk Blog, I get a lot of the news through editing my writers and through talking through their stories with them. I try, this will be the part that makes people mad and makes me sort of decidedly unfuture of media. Like, I really try not to get my news from Twitter, which I think is has a reputation as a place people go to find lots of great news. I find it a place you go to find, I guess, your barbecued potato chips. It's just a lot of stuff that is kind of interesting, mostly not that good, and absolutely chewed over into cud by the time you get to it. And so I've been trying to make a very concerted effort to create structures on my computer using different kinds of software and so forth that force me to get less of my news through social media and more of it by reading my RSS feed, which are blogs, or going to other news sites. I really have begun to worry that it gets really easy to tilt into a Twitter-centric news diet because you feel if you're not following it, you've missed something and it's gone forever because the conversation doesn't archive in any readable way. And I think that creates a kind of obsessive quality that leads to an over-reliance on it far outside of what the signal-to-noise ratio of not just tweets but actual links on Twitter would be. So that's my part to make people on Twitter mad.
I think people in this room would probably be slightly disappointed in us if they knew how much the news media is just arbitraging Twitter, where they're just looking at Twitter and then they're posting something, and then it goes to Google News, and then people try and arbitrage Google News. And so there's all of these interesting kind of systems, like technical systems that are playing into your news production now.
I read Reddit. It was my job
It's
for
kind of your
a
thing.
while when Steve and I started it, but I actually limit myself to about an hour and a half a day tops. There actually is good software to limit you from viewing particular sites for certain amounts of time. And I don't really consume any other news. There's usually a Daily Show episode or a Colbert Report episode, which I know is not actually news, but I don't know. Sometimes they talk about things I wish other people would talk about on real news programs. And the rest of my news consumption actually happens much later from books. I love reading nonfiction, and I find that it's not. There's obviously a much longer window there, but I find that it just gives such an amazing, just much richer overview that I can get my crack, I can get my hour a day of Reddit, but if I really want to understand the future of the internet industry, I'll sit down and read Master Switch by Tim Wu, great book, which is the last thing I read. So it's a little old school.
I want to revise and extend my remarks and add both Colbert and Daily Show.
Yes.
And in fact, they are new. I mean, not only are they news, but the degree to which just on the level of doing this amazing archival work and calling people to account for things they said last week or last year or 5 years ago is an extraordinary journalistic activity that I find it every day and every week amazed that the real news entities have not done.
Can I also revise and extend?
Totally.
One thing that I find useful, and I've come to think a lot of folks in our profession are doing now, is the other thing that happens at the end of the night for me is through the day I'm clicking around, and every time I come across something that I don't quite have time for, I send it to Pocket, which is this program. Another one is called Instapaper. There are a bunch of these, and it saves the file offline. And so I find at the end of the day I've typically built up 5 or 10 or even 15 articles that I just didn't have time to give the concentration to, and it kind of acts as a mop-up agent for me. And so I do find that I get a lot of digesting sort of long form I came across or more complicated pieces where I just knew I didn't have the focus. It's actually become, I think, an absolutely crucial part of my media diet.
Same. Why don't we stay with you, Ezra? Kind of give me your sort of pocket history of what's happened with media in the last 5 years, kind of bringing us up to the present. Starting kind of, in the early 21st century American media, like that kind of style of pocket history of what you see that happened. And we're going to go to...
I'm going to frame it differently.
Sure.
I think to just back it up instead of what we began reading, here's the, I think, essential problem for media, or the essential thing we're dealing with, which is that for the vast majority of the 20th century, if you think about this like an economist always says, what is relevant scarcity in any given place, right? What are people not have enough of, so they're fighting over? The relevant scarcity that the media attempted to address, what our business was based upon, was information. People did not have enough information about the world around them. And you lived in a town or a city and you had a newspaper or 2 newspapers if you were lucky. There were a couple channels that did news for an hour or 2 a day. You had the radio. You did not have much information. And I think that an enormous amount of the news culture, not just newspapers as like a technological artifact, but also how we report the news, how we do a lot of the actual writing of it, was about trying to give people as much news as we possibly could, given the actual space we had to talk with them and given their enormous appetite. The dramatic change, I think, which is driven by technology, but is not, in my view, fundamentally technological, is that now we are confronted, the primary problem media is attempting to solve to some degree is abundance of information. People have much too much information. It isn't to say they don't still need news broken. It isn't to say somebody doesn't need to get that news first. All of that remains true and critical, but from the perspective of a consumer, it's happening. It is completely overwhelming. And so it is a dramatic change in how you have to run a media business if you're moving from trying to get people information they didn't have to trying to help people sort through this absolute torrential flood of information they do have, and not just that they do have, but is being pushed at them, that is being emailed to them, that is being tweeted at them, that are hearing about on TV. And I don't think we've completely made that transition, but I do think if you think about a lot of the forms that have emerged in recent years, blogging, of course, began. I'd say the person you kind of have to credit with really figuring out the form is Instapundit, who was really just a kind of a links aggregator. He was a way of sorting out the amazing amount of abundant information we could get. I think a lot of what blogging ended up doing with the quoting and the sort of styles of writing also had to do with a kind of aggregation. Obviously now products like the Atlantic Wire that are a very big deal. The kind of listicle nature of BuzzFeed and to some degree the Huffington Post, again, is a way of bringing order. At Wonkblog, we spend a lot of time using mechanisms like X in one graph or this in 2 minutes to try to reduce like the cognitive anxiety of learning about complicated topics in a world where you don't have enough time. But I do think that a lot of the changes being driven now are people trying to figure out how to move from, okay, your problem is information and we're going to give you information, to your problem is too much information and we're going to help you find your way through it and understand how to process it.
Kurt, I'm curious how that strikes you as someone who's been in magazines for a long time, which always seem to have that function of sort of helping you cut through a lot of noise.
Well, it's been clear to me for a while, certainly since the turn of the century, that magazines, print magazines, had become like sailing ships became in the late 19th century. They would stick around for a while, but motorized, engine-driven boats would take over and they would become quaint artifacts for the upscale eventually. And that's, I think, what's happening with print magazines. I think the other thing, in addition to this, dealing with the problem of abundance of information that Ezra talked about, a kind of connected and to some degree collateral aspect of that is also enabled by technology, is that one way of dealing with that is to surround yourself in your electronic silo of people who agree with you 100%. And of course, to some degree, the last half of the 20th century was an anomaly in the history of the American press. In the 19th century, partisan press was all there was until the late part of that century. But so, okay, we've been here before, now we're reverting to the pre-World War II state of affairs where everything is partisan. But I think it's a new condition that we don't know yet how that's going to redound. The fact that so many millions of people, left and right, can exclusively receive information, and information in quotes, that reinforces their opinions in a way that wasn't possible before. It is a new condition. It's not just like, a Whig newspaper in 1850. It's because of the 24/7 nature of it and keeping people riled, all the time. And I think we see how it affects governance in Washington. I think we will see in our lifetimes, your lifetime certainly, that it is a huge change in the way people, Americans, understand the truth and reality.
And do you see institutions, any of you, that can counter that impulse, that can provide objective information, whatever we mean by objective in that particular case?
Well, fair-minded at least.
Fair-minded.
Objectivity got a bad
I like
reputation.
that. I like fair-minded. That's good. Yeah. I mean, do you see institutions that can counter that, like say the nonprofit news agency ProPublica that can do some of those things, or is it more that we need a BuzzFeed of fair-minded journalism that can actually compete out there in the kind of social world in order to gain the kind of traction that partisan news can?
Well, you've still got national newspapers like the Washington Post, and the New York Times, and the Wall Street Journal that are, in their journalism, try to be fair-minded and try to report and all those things. You've got, public radio, NPR and other public radio forums to which 30 million people listen. So it's, my belief is that it's the best of times and the worst of times, as so many times are. That for people who are curious and not ideologically blinded, it's a golden age of finding information here, there, and everywhere. And I suppose it's a golden age of a different kind for people who are incurious and ideologues, but to the detriment of the Republic.
Let me just add one thing to that. The clustering topic and the filter bubble, as people like to call it, is a real serious problem and a real dangerous threat. I do think, though, that in rooms like this one, where people are highly kind of politically engaged and folks know, and everybody sort of we know reads a lot of political news, people can overstate the degree to which it is actually happening. So, I mean, it's worth noting that on any given night, MSNBC, who I'm a contributor to, and Fox News have a absolutely infinitesimal fraction of the television audience. And it is also the case that the major blogs or partisan press outlets, you might think of sort of a National Review on the right, or a more liberal magazine on the left, like The Nation. They also are very small, and they've had audience growth in this period, but it's been nothing like the audience growth of a Washington Post, a New York Times, or for that matter, a BuzzFeed. And I think it's fair to say the Huffington Post is a little bit more of a center-left orientation, but they too are doing a lot of reporting. I mean, their actual news gathering apparatus is very skilled and highly adversarial to the administration, even if I think it's fair to call them relatively liberal. And so I do think that while it is completely the case that there is a clustering, and particularly among intense, politically engaged partisans, I also think that to some degree, in terms of the average voter, the average news consumer, there's a bit less of it going on than can sometimes be taken for granted in these conversations.
Yeah. Alexis, how does this strike you? Yeah.
Well, I'd actually go so far as to say I think there's a hunger. I'm going to go ahead and just speak for millennials. I think there is a hunger for just reasonable discourse, and I'm going to give you lots of anecdotal evidence. But I mean, I was one of hundreds of thousands of people who showed up at the mall in D.C. for the Rally to Restore Sanity and/or Fear. Which, as you can imagine, was a demographic of a lot of millennials. There were a broader number of people.
So it was a Jon Stewart Colbert event.
Yeah, the idea spawned on a subreddit, and a few months later, we all found ourselves in the middle of the lawn. But you saw people holding signs like, there are no spelling errors on this sign, and let's stop yelling at each other and just have a discussion. I think I would wager to say, and I see this, I mean, Reddit's sample is only about 70 million visitors a month, but it's not totally significant enough sample for the entire generation, but still, there is a hunger for just facts. There's a hunger for something that doesn't feel like either party ramming partisan party lines down your throat. And I think the real winners, I think most recently seeing the rise of a guy like Nate Silver is, I think, partially fueled by a bunch of people just saying like, oh wow, he managed to talk about a political race without ever flailing his arms or getting angry, but just talking about numbers and data and polling and what the American people actually think. And we see so many disconnects between what Americans supposedly believe and then how our representatives act that don't jibe. And every one of you has got a bunch of issues where I know in agreement here. We'd like to see those sync up a bit more, and I think it can happen.
Just to play devil's advocate, because I want to believe that that's true.
I am an optimist.
Is there some of that is aspirational? Like, people want to believe that what they want to see is facts and fair-minded journalism, but what gets the outrage machine going and what gets people like flowing around the internet really quickly are the latest thing to be angry about that's coming from a skewed perspective.
It's definitely a lot easier to hit retweet on something that is inflammatory than something that is reasonable. But you have to be careful. I'll give you a perfect example of this. In any of this product development, we talk about the 1% rule, which is not what you think it is. This holds for every social media website, where 1% of the traffic actually creates all of the content, 9% sort of interacts with it, and then about 90% doesn't do anything. So when you see the floods of tweets, when you see the floods, know that it's 10% or less of the entire body of people actually using the site. And there's this silent majority of who I believe are mostly reasonable people who we're never actually hearing from, even on these democratic platforms.
Although that's an interesting, the 1% rule to apply to what Ezra said, I think correctly, that we got to remember that the largest Fox News audience, Bill O'Reilly, is 2.5 million people. It's nothing. However, that 1% in that case, and the 1% of those passionate ideological audiences have, as never in my lifetime, it is a tail wagging the dog in Washington that has not existed. And because, when you had a mainstream media run by a few white men and Washington run by, mainstream bipartisan thing, you could ignore the wingnuts. The wingnuts can no longer be ignored, and even though they're a tiny audience, they punch way, way, way above their weight in terms of affecting what goes on in Washington.
Let me make 2 quick points on this. One, on this sort of political polarization, the degree that this 1% is wagging the dog. Political polarization, essentially my favorite thing in the world to talk about, and so I'll try to keep it short, but it's only to say that this kind of golden bipartisan age we talk about of the 40s and the 50s and 60s was built atop an ideological extremism of a type that is absolutely abhorrent in America now, which is to say the parties were essentially scrambled because Southern racists were in the Democratic Party and Northern liberals were in the Republican Party. You can't have the kind of party polarization we have if you have Democrats more conservative than Republicans and conservatives or Republicans more liberal than Democrats. But when we equate that era with moderation, right? I think we mix up two concepts. I think we mix up ideological moderation and a kind of a procedural party efficacy. This is, I think, a fairly ideologically moderate time if you think about the kinds of issues we were dealing with in the 50s and 60s, even as we're very polarized in Washington. The other point in terms of the degree to which people want fact-based, et cetera, content versus partisan content, the great lie of newspapers, or the great false choice, I think, that our strictures have put on this conversation, is that all this content exists on a continuum, where over here is news, and that's fact-based and calm and rational and kind of boring. And over here is opinion, and that's hot and it's interesting, but it doesn't have any facts in it. And I actually think a lot of the examples you bring up, and a lot of what people just want on the internet and want in the media more generally, is on an interestingness continuum.
Yeah.
BuzzFeed is not coming up so quickly because they're highly liberal or highly conservative. They are interesting. You go and you are interested, and Reddit is deeply interesting. And there are interesting things happening on both sides of the aisle, and interesting things that have nothing to do with either side of the aisle. But when you talk about the rally to restore sanity and/or fear, Jon Stewart and Stephen Colbert are interesting, and that was an interesting thing to do for the day. There was really not that much about politics, but it was about going and making silly signs. And I do think, I find that cheering, and I think it is a challenge to this sort of older media or larger outlets, where the way we are going to be able to compete and the way we're going to be able to keep people from falling into filter bubbles is by making our content interesting. And that does not have to mean moving in one direction or the other across that news and opinion spectrum. It is about how we write and how we think about it and how we innovate literally and how we present our stories and how we choose our stories.
Yep.
I think that's absolutely right what you just said, and I have waited for the rehabilitation of CNN to happen by them realizing that it's not that you can be interesting and exciting and without being left-wing or right-wing, right? Do you know? And they just have failed to.
I work for MSNBC, so I'm waiting for the CNN rehabilitation to not happen.
I want to dig in with a specific news event. How many people here heard about Wendy Davis's filibuster in the Texas Senate? Okay, good. So how many of you heard about it the night that it was happening? Again, and how many of you heard about it on a mainstream cable news network? A couple. Okay, so there's a little bit of coverage that night. A lot of how that got going, and I think what's so interesting about it is that one of the big worries that you'd hear over and over about this new era of journalism is who's going to cover the State House, right? Like Ezra is going to come to the Post and he's going to do a great job for them on national news and these issues, but like papers used to be really good at covering the State House, so who's going to cover that? And what we saw was a live stream from a nonprofit news organization, the Texas Tribune, streaming what was basically a procedural fight on the Texas Senate floor about an abortion bill. And you had 170,000 people watching the live stream at, I think it was something like 2 a.m. Texas time. Can't remember, you were up.
It was very late.
Yes, and I kind of wanted to just examine this as like a particular moment. Like, what did the actual ecosystem look like? And Ezra, I'm going to start with you just because I know you were up because you wrote a post about it.
Yeah, and I was a signing post about it, and I had to get up at 2:45 in the morning to come here, so I was not super pleased that Wendy Davis picked that night to filibuster. All right, I'm going to be a downer, and you probably should have begun with something else. I think there is essentially nothing we can learn from that. I think that was lightning in a bottle. I think it says very little about our ability to cover state houses. That was an exciting thing that went viral. And any of us who do this, you at The Atlantic, you at Reddit, we all know we can't predict what will go viral. We write things and we think, this is great. I'm putting this out into the wild and it is going to get 32 bazillion hits. And 4 days later, 22 people and a dog have looked at it. And it's enormously frustrating. But what we saw with Wendy Davis, I think, are two things. One, that was just like a camera staring at a person who was doing something that was very dramatic and it affected people emotionally. And I mean, it's perfect for the internet and perfect for streaming and perfect for sharing. It is not State House coverage. And the ability to cover that, there were great reporters in Texas doing that work for weeks and weeks beforehand, and they deserve a lot of credit for that, and at the Texas Tribune and Erica Grider and lots of others. But I really think that does not make me feel any better about what's going on. That I think is more...
It doesn't create the institutions to cover this.
Not only that, but it robs them. I mean, here's one thing that did happen that night, all right? And I'll just use myself as an example. The Fix, which is our counterpart political blog, and Wonk blog, both at the Post, both put up the live stream, and we both got a lot of hits, and we had thousands and thousands of people watching it. And we were essentially robbing that traffic from the Texas Tribune, which had actually found this thing out. Now, I wasn't the one who put it up, so I don't remember if we were using their live stream and they got the traffic. I don't know the tech behind what we did there. But I think the event was great for Texas, but a lot of what was happening there, the way the media swooped in, it looks to me like great follow through. I'm much more worried about a world in which all the incentives are towards finding those little things happening instead of doing the reporting before it. Because you know what? By the time Wendy Davis was filibustering, if you dislike that legislation or you like it, that was almost a done deal. And the time we needed the journalism on that was 3 months ago and 2 months ago, and the time that places like WonkBlog needed to be paying attention to what the reporters in Texas who are doing this were saying were 3 months ago or 2 months ago. So I'm frustrated at us for missing that, and so I'm not going to pat us on the back for jumping on the traffic train that night. I think that showed the bad job we've been doing, not the good one.
This is interesting. I think I agree with you, but I want to play devil's advocate, just because I do think there is something interesting about it that isn't just limited to Wendy Davis. You do see with what I guess I would call like extreme breaking news, difficult to predict breaking news, you see self-organization of different types by people both in and outside media coming together to like form a different kind of coverage. And there are problems with it, but there's also really, really interesting things about it. I mean, Alexis, I kind of want to go to you here. I was probably like the meanest to Reddit about their coverage of the Boston Marathon bombing, or just one of the subreddits who were discussing news around who the Boston Marathon bombers might be. But I still found the phenomenon interesting and something that maybe can be harnessed. Maybe there's, SCOTUS blog, I think, is another more expert and professionalized version where you can have things come together around specific events that then become institutionalized and then become something that's actually useful outside of the one event. You want to talk about Reddit? Reddit and news, self-organization, particularly around extreme breaking news.
I think all of these social media platforms, whether it's Reddit, Twitter, Tumblr, just to name a few, do a very good job allowing someone to come up with an idea, and if some other random person likes it, it can spread, right? These are how memes go viral. And through some basic constraints of software, people have found ways to create all kinds of stuff. And so you had, a story that probably wouldn't have left Texas be reblogged and memified, and all of these images and stories being told all over the world, but certainly all over the US. It's tricky though, because all of these platforms I just named are just tools. And so the way people use Reddit is you can create a subreddit, which is a platform for online communities to share links and have discussions. So it's like creating a Tumblr blog, except anyone can contribute links to it and anyone can have discussions to it. And sometimes it allows you to create, it allows people like here in this audience to create awesome stuff, very creative stuff like random acts of pizza, where after the Boston bombing, people were donating free pizzas to anyone in Boston. Strangers just giving pizzas to other strangers. Conversely, it also lets people, and unfortunately, witch hunt is a phrase we use today that is far removed from the horrors of what it was in early America and in Europe. But witch hunt today is still a flaw of humans. And this technology enables ideas to spread, like I said, faster and further than ever before. And in this instance, you had some well-intentioned but very misguided people who wanted to use all of the content that was freely available, all the photos of the bombing, the little bit of police information that had been put out, to try to solve a crime. They wanted to be involved and ultimately should not have been involved in trying to do that because they are not law enforcement. That's the role of law enforcement. The challenge is, on the one hand, we've seen law enforcement go to the internet before and say, we need help, here are the facts of this case. This has been done numerous times, but it's been done explicitly with the consent and instruction and guidance of law enforcement. So that enables people and sort of excites people. And then there are other times when people don't have all the information, and yet we are still humans subject to our own stupidity, especially en masse. And you get things like what happened during the Reddit bombing. During the Boston bombing.
What?
News flash breaking. And you ultimately had a totally innocent person who was missing at the time be falsely accused. The challenge is when you create a platform where anyone can put out a tweet or anyone can put out a Reddit post or anyone can put out a Tumblr blog, it allows for that opportunity. We have to be good stewards of the technology, and I know, I don't think this is shifting the blame, but the fact that the New York Post put it on their front page the next day is, starts to make us wonder, again, what are the roles of journalists? I have never said and will never say that social media will replace journalism. Journalism is so important because at a time we have more noise than ever, we need someone to sift through it. But the challenge is, you build a platform and you can't control how people ultimately use it. You can create as many guidelines as you want, but still, people are tenacious. And most of the time that's good, but not always.
I wouldn't use the New York Post probably as a defense for what happened on Reddit. No, I'm just saying. But what I wanted to say is I wanted to go back to the Wendy in Texas thing, which, as was right, no doubt, about its lack in and of itself of ongoing watershed importance. However, as a spectacular piece of theater to bring attention to the Texas Tribune, which is a great thing with a new model, not new, it's the public media model, but they're doing it in what is now print, fantastic. And the Texas Tribune deserves, as a way to market itself and make another extra million people aware of it, I'm all for it. And the future of journalism, to the degree it has a happy future, are for there to be more successful Texas Tribunes rather than the unsuccessful other versions that have been tried so far.
Kurt, before we turn to the audience, so get your questions ready and Mike's ready. You founded Inside.com in 1999,
correct?
Right? So we're now 14 years out from you founding your first website. I mean, what has surprised you the most about the turns that digital media has taken from now till then?
Well, there wasn't advertising then, so that's a big change. I would say I am surprised. When we did that in 1999, it covered entertainment and media broadly construed. It was a news service. I figured that there would be, by this time, 20 sort of staffed, 21st century versions of newspapers online. And the fact that hasn't happened, I guess, is the biggest surprise to me. The fact that, BuzzFeed is BuzzFeed, and they're doing, in their way, an amazing job, and they have 100 journalists and people, quasi-journalists, and they will continue, and they're doing great. But I thought that by now, it would be like, 1940 or 1900 in newspapers, that there would be this proliferation that has not taken place. So I guess that's my biggest surprise.
Let's go. Who has a question out there? There's one right there.
You started to just talk about this just now, but I'm interested in getting some thoughts from you guys about money, because you guys were talking about Huffington Post before. A lot of that content, it's freely generated for the Huffington Post. I happen to know people who work there, and while there are reporters there and people who are well trained, the resources are limited. So I'm just wondering, in terms of looking into the near future, can digital journalism support a digital newsroom?
Who wants to take that on?
You're an editor.
I don't know. Let me begin by saying one thing here, which is that I think that a problem in these panels all the time is to mistake the difficulties of editorial, the ways we're falling short in our content, for the ways we are falling with the problems of the business side. I'm a believer in subscription models. The Post just moved to a paywall. I believe in us doing that. I'm not sure I agree with literally every bit of how we did it, but I think that's going to be a big part of the future. I'm a believer in, you're going to have a fair amount of advertising. You're probably going to have more native advertising. There are going to be creative things folks have not thought of yet. But the unhappy part of the answer here, and the one people don't really like, is there has been an enormous productivity increase in the journalistic profession. The amount of journalism individual journalists can produce, good journalism that is achieving and it is yoked to high standards, is vastly higher than it was 20 years ago. And people don't, I think, love to deal with this, but just being able to search things on Google as opposed to go into the microfiche category of your library, that moves things much quicker. Getting your sources on email as opposed to on phones, or even on their cell phones as opposed to waiting for them to return to their office and get a message, that moves things much quicker. Being able to publish immediately to the internet. I believe that we will be able to support, certainly when we're talking about national news, a very healthy media sphere online, and for quite a while yet in print as well.
What about local?
What about local? I don't know. And I think that is going to be a space where it's going to be very hard to generate enough revenue, and you're going to see potentially a lot coming in from nonprofits and a lot coming in from charitable organizations. And one thing that I think people don't like to talk about, but that I do think should be discussed at least a little bit more on the table, is what kind of support the public sector can give that. If we consider local to be an important public good, local journalism, and we should, there are a lot of examples in Europe and elsewhere of how the public sector can support those organizations, including one we do for a lot of groups right now, which is simply tax-exempt status. Making that easier to get would be one possibility. This does get into a lot of different problems, but I don't think the problems are actually so different from having advertisers if you're doing this in a kind of blind way, the way it is done elsewhere, and also the way it's done, by the way, for NPR and PBS. So when you're talking about the local and sort of small mid-metropolitan newspaper, I think that sort of a mixture of revenue and charitable, and then potentially in the long term, if we don't see these things as viable enough, public sector support are going to have to come into play.
I'd add one note there, which is just that I think if you can get advertising delivered out to people on the streets via a device that they're like consuming out there, and we don't actually have a lot of content that is made to be consumed out in the world. The stories that tend to do well on mobile devices, the stories that tend to do well on desktop too. And so there's not a lot of reason for people to be engaging with media out in the world. And that's actually the kind of advertising that might be really valuable because you can hit people right where they're actually going to spend the money. And so my hope, and I think public support and these things might be good too, but my hope on the business side is that model really develops because it things like a Google Glass might allow you to create content that's meant to be consumed like right out there, and then you can get hit with advertising there too, and that could support local journalism in a way that the newspaper form or blogs don't right now.
But to the degree that much of what we bemoan is being lost, state house coverage, boring, important stuff that's not being done and will continue not to be done, was able to be done when newspapers were monopoly businesses in their cities. And so they could afford the economically irrational act of having a reporter covering this boring stuff and printing it. That, in an age where everybody can read only what they want to read and don't have to take the medicine that's good for them that tastes bad, that's not going to exist. I mean, I don't see, I mean, that was an economically irrational act on the part of monopolists. That in the near future, I don't see that happening without some other model and shifting the economic irrationality to young journalists who work for nothing.
But and to be just slightly ideological about it, like this is a fact of the neoliberal age. I mean, I often wonder, in this era, would the library ever be invented? I mean, that's an economically irrational act. I mean, I imagine we give today people, lower income people, book vouchers that they could take to a private institution and buy books. And so, I mean, we're gonna, at some point, have to have a real conversation at that level, not at the national level where I think the economics are much better, but at that level about whether or not we consider journalism a public good. And if that kind of accountability journalism is a public good, and particularly when you're dealing with something where it gets funded nationally, but it's reporting locally, where you can imagine a reasonable distance, I think we're going to have to become more comfortable with at least talking about that and being able to watch the trend lines in the media more closely.
Let's go right there. Oh, I think she's going to get you the mic. Just a second.
Thanks. As a 20-year plus old school journalist for magazines, freelancer, I would have to argue that getting it faster and having more of it doesn't necessarily make it better at all. And in fact, you know, in years past, when I was doing a story, I didn't have Twitter, and I couldn't just go boom, boom, boom and write a story and have half of it be completely wrong. In fact, I had to go out and do my own research. I had to talk to people. I had to not just email them and get the vanilla version of whatever it is they wanted to say to me in 3 lines, but I had the chance to actually talk to them either on the phone or face to face, get a sense for what they were saying and how they were saying it. It's a completely different thing today. And I don't necessarily think it's a better thing.
But I don't think there's, I could be wrong, I don't think there's less of that. I totally agree with what you said about the virtues of taking a long time to do things and doing them right. But there is still the New Yorker with circulation of 1 million. There is still Vanity Fair with a circulation of 1 million. There's still the New York Times. There is the print world that you're regarding as the gold standard, and I agree with you, still exists. It's not as though it's a zero-sum thing as all this fast, half-correct, history-on-the-fly stuff has arisen. I don't know that there's less important long-form journalism.
I don't know who these journalists are who are reading 5 tweets and then writing it. I mean, that's really not in any journalistic outlet how things are working. I hear what you're saying, and every method you talk about is correct, but it's what the people, at Wonkblog are doing, it's what the people at The Atlantic are doing, it's what the people at the Huffington Post journalism side are doing, not the folks who are working for free, but the reporters. This is still done, and there is, on some level, more good journalism out there and accessible to the consumer than ever. I mean, one of the difficult things in these conversations, when they happen between reporters, the state of the information available gets bemoaned. If you are a news consumer, the amount of good, reported, serious, thought-through, expert-driven journalism you can get now is vastly beyond everything else. And I don't think these techniques have been lost or even to a large degree degraded. I think people understand and aspire to and practice a lot of what you're saying there. Well, how did you ever know what to believe? There were a lot of people at newspapers who were bad. Like, this has always been true. But you find places, and you can see, I think, over time, is what they're saying credible? Is it getting disproven either by other outlets or in comments? I mean, I think that the amount of accountability that is imposed on other journalists now is much higher. Now you have places where people don't care. I think people go to Breitbart and don't care that the rest of the world believes Breitbart to have very shoddy journalistic standards. That's not why they're going there. But insofar as you want truth, you can find it.
One thing I would say about magazine journalism specifically, particularly on the longer side, is I think there is a difference in the way that people scope stories. Even long stories in print and things that are going to have to sit on a shelf for a while versus what we do online. And I think that it means that you're going to cover different types of topics. You're going to cover them in different ways. And that can be bad. I will say that. Were you going to say something? Or do you want to?
I feel like other people have questions.
Okay. Let's take, what have we got? Let's go right here in the front.
You're really making her work with that.
Yeah, sorry about that.
I just want to do a pitch.
Throw it. Yeah.
Hi, Stefan Edley, Chicago. Simple question regarding delivery, news delivery. Leaving John and Steve aside, they're in the class of themselves, so they're outside the ballpark. Personally, we get 2 papers. We get two Chicago dailies, the Gray Lady and the Pink Sheet. I have on Kindle, I have 4 papers. My choices always are to go toward print. My question is simply, we know circulation is going down. Is it going to level off? Is it going to disappear? Where is newsprint going to be in the next 5 or 10 years?
I think it's going to look like LPs. I think. What? No, my dad is still, and I admit the fidelity on those LPs are a lot better. The reality of it is, let's imagine I don't have children. When I have children, they will get exposed to that, right? Just because I really like dead tree news. But the majority of kids won't, right? You see the videos of the 1-year-old with the it's a great video. She's sitting in front of a bunch of magazines, swiping, and she's wondering why the batteries are broken on this iPad. I think a lot of it is just affinity, and unfortunately, I don't think it'll ever go away. It won't go away totally, but it'll just become this niche. Someone had mentioned it in an earlier panel as being equivalent to like sailboats and yachting.
Right. Oh, yeah,
But
I like
this panel.
Yeah. Yes, there we go. Earlier. 30 minutes ago.
You kids today.
Things move very quick on the internet age up here.
You guys want to go ride bicycles?
Maybe last question right here, and then I want to play this lightning round, but maybe we'll have time for one more here, right there.
Hi, thanks so much. Quick question. You've mentioned, there's now increased information and there's going to be a need for increased organization. We've talked about political polarization, everything else. And for me, I feel like and actually what happened post Boston bombing, and I followed that with Reddit. And what I feel is that we're, as users, as consumers, people are really beginning to lack judgment, right? So we've got more information, we've got more organization. How do we increase the correct judgment in the consumer to not let something that seems completely, possibly erroneous go so viral? Even you look at the stuff that's being reported about Snowden, what's going on, what's not going on. You could read 1,000 things and things get retweeted and things get reposted. Where's the judgment and what role do we all have? That's one example, but even with Wendy Davis, there's things that are going on now as well. Where's the judgment in the consumer and what role does someone like Reddit or MSNBC or whomever in journalism have to try and corral that in a way?
Well, let me say, so in the camp of like social media platforms like Twitter and Reddit and Facebook, I mean, historically speaking, no one has ever, I mean, Zuckerberg's never come out and said, you guys should really stop cyberbullying. No one on Twitter has ever said this. The thinking has been, this is the platform, and we can try to encourage people, but the gift and the curse of social media is that anyone with an internet connection now has a voice. Like, there's no editorial because it's just you typing and it being public. I don't know, because as it spreads, I mean, if it hits the ubiquity we all kind of hope for, in that everyone has access and everyone has ability, it's going to mean voices that have been historically marginalized will get to be heard. And that's great. The curse of it is voices that probably should be marginalized will get to be heard. And that's not great. And I don't know, because I can't change people. We have to obviously give good examples, but I don't know.
Yeah, I think on our side, on the journalism side, I think we can show you examples where people say, hey, look, there's all these fake pictures of the Sandy hurricane out there, and we can do something to help you fact check whether or not these are real or fake before you share them on Facebook, and people are interested in that. But it's not like that's going to work every single time, right? And you still have to see that one post. It's a difficult problem. Let's play this lightning round. So the deal here is, I don't want long answers for these at all. This is basically almost yes or no, though maybe I'll give you a sentence of explanation if required. Okay. Will the New York Times still be publishing on paper in 2020?
Yes, but it'll be a special, elite, expensive hipster edition.
2020, of course.
Probably.
Probably. Who will generate greater profits in 2015? Condé Nast or Twitter? Profits, I'm talking here.
Yeah.
Actually making money.
Wait, what year?
2015. Very
Oh,
soon.
Condé Nast,
For sure.
definitely.
They seem confident, so I'm saying Condé Nast.
And his company was purchased
I
by
just
Condé
did.
Nast. This one I'll give you a little more time on. What's the most exciting news media venture that you see out there that's sort of doing something new
that's easy.
and exciting? 1 to 2 sentences. Maybe a little
And
more.
not just because I'm an investor and love plugging them, but Upworthy is actually trying to take a stab at
So you can tell them what Upworthy is.
So it's a news organization, a remarkably fast-growing one that's just been around for about a year, trying to create content that will go viral as best as one can, but that is socially good. So it's trying to take all the best practices from like cat videos and applying them to socially good content. Sometimes with cats, but not necessarily.
I hate how this answer is going to come off. We are going to launch something, I believe in late July, maybe in early August, that I am more excited about than anything I've worked on since I've been in journalism, but I cannot tell you what it is yet.
You tease. You tease.
But stay tuned to
then
Wonk Blog.
pick somebody else, some other
So pick
venture.
someone else?
Yeah.
Well, have Kirk go and then I'll come up with a new answer.
Okay.
I don't know if it counts as news, and they're my colleagues, not me, but Radiolab is an extraordinary piece of media creation that has been overpraised, but so what? It deserves every bit.
That's good. I'll go with Planet Money then. I think similarly they're coming up with an incredibly new way of storytelling. I think that the way they choose stories and the way they begin at the beginning is phenomenal. Their web presence is amazing. I think that I think their ability to make economics interesting is really, and interesting being again the key word for me here, is kind of unparalleled and kind of amazing, and I find them really exciting.
Cool. Here you go. Did Glenn Greenwald handle the Snowden leaks well? Not as you would have, but did he handle them well? We'll start with you, Chris.
Sure.
You could say more if you want to.
No, he handled them. I mean, he fine. I mean, the Guardian is how much of a more legit set of gatekeepers and editors do you need than the Guardian? I thought he handled it fine. He is who he is, and he's the sort of person who's going to piss people off coming and going, and he managed to do that as well. But beyond that, I thought he did a fine job.
I agree, and I thought it was a good moment. I mean, I think it's a good thing Glenn is at The Guardian now. I think that collaboration there has worked really, really well. Their ability to follow up, report on what he's doing, and build on top. That's my friend Spencer Ackerman is there now, has been doing a lot of work on it. I mean, I think it's been a really inspiring period of journalism from them.
And as a member of Team Edward,
Twilight we're talking about?
Of course, Twilight, Edward. I totally agree with Glenn's work, but I really want to point out one of the interesting things in this age we live in. Historically, if we had ever been exposed to a whistleblower, the person, we would have done it through someone else's filter. And what was so brilliant about the way that was executed was him sitting in front of a camera, just talking like a reasonable person, like someone we'd be totally comfortable sitting next to on a bus.
So Laura Poitras, like the actual filmmaker, is an activist who created the video. So I mean, there was a filter.
Oh, sorry. Okay, there was a filter, but it was not media, or it was not other people describing this person. We got to judge Edward Snowden on Edward Snowden's terms of him talking into a camera. And I think what has been so challenging about this for the people who don't care about the Fourth Amendment is that he really does come off as a reasonable person who really felt like he was doing the right thing by not exposing state secrets, by saying very frankly that he's not advocating a particular agenda. He just wanted the American people to decide for themselves if they were okay with this. And it's compelling because now you can't just say, oh, this person was a nut job. I mean, they tried, right? They literally 2 weeks after saying, you guys heard it, you might have heard he was a high school dropout. They used that phrase as this term of disdain. And literally 2 weeks earlier, David Karp was a high school dropout. The exact same phrase being attributed as this sign of praise for a brilliant tech wunderkind somehow became a tarnish 2 weeks later. So it's little things like that I think are a sign of how well executed that was and what a great age we live in.
So one figure we haven't talked about at all is a guy named Julian Assange. Everyone knows who he is, runs WikiLeaks, sort of an odd, oblique news figure. Do you think he's Bond villain or William Gibson hero?
Well, I don't know the difference between those, except one is better written than the other. But Bond, I called him a Bond villain as soon as he appeared. I'm sticking with my story.
Okay.
Neither.
What do you think of him as?
I honestly don't have super well-formed thoughts on Julian Assange. I think what he's doing is complicated, and like Edward Snowden, has some real public purpose to it, and then some stuff that I think is not as admirable. But he's not somebody I've covered closely, and it's not a set of stories I feel super comfortable commenting on.
Fair enough.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm looking forward to seeing the film. That's how I'll make my decision, because Hollywood informs all of my decision making.
We will give the audience the last question. Who wants it out there? Nobody? We've got two in the back you can fight over.
You can do both. You can answer both.
Yeah, let's get a mic over there.
So basically, I want to know who's going to pay the journalists, and I guess I know an investigative journalist who said the way to do good investigative journalism on the State House is to go up and read through all the financial dealings, which takes a long time and it's very expensive. So who's going to pay for that?
Was actually kind of the same. What's the economic model? I mean, LA Times laid off a ton of reporters. The Washington Post has gone through lots of rounds of laying off reporters. And so what's the economic model for good journalism?
Not to totally dodge, but we're on the editorial side. So this is part of one of the issues. I mean, I think the best answer that maybe I can give to this is that we've learned how to compete against other types at The Atlantic, other types of news, so that people sort of like our brand like a little bit more than the other guys. And that means they come to our site a little bit more often, which means we serve a few more ads, which means we can pay a few more people. And I don't know that there's any like silver bullet. It's just doing that same thing every single day, 365 days a year, for years and years, and that's how we get paid. And so far it's worked, and the newsroom has expanded, and other organizations have done similar things. It's just that the actual distribution of coverage might be different, and that's when some of these other models will have to come into play.
I mean, people have to pay. You're going to pay. The answer is who's going to pay, whether it's paying, via the intermediary of advertising, or subscribing, as I would prefer, or giving money to the Texas Tribunes and NPRs of the world. So you're going to pay. I mean, Daddy's not going to pay. The government's not going to pay. You're going to pay. And the other thing I will say, the slightly hopeful thing, and again, it feeds into my statement before that I was surprised that more 100 flowers haven't bloomed yet in the digital realm. But it is easier to start a thing from scratch and figure out a business model, whether it's BuzzFeed or HuffPo or whatever, than it is to be the Washington Post and figure out how you're going to manage what feels like nothing but a decline. So, I'm a believer in the invisible hand, and I think in many ways, and in the invisible hand of economics will manage to pay people if consumers of news demand news of a certain quality.
Or I would flip that last bit. If we create news that you want, that's what we're going to have to do at the Washington Post. And I think there's some sense of decline there, but there's also a lot of really exciting things happening in that room. It's a big room. You can do amazing work out of it. And the thing that our job now, and this is one salutary effect of a paywall, is we need to come to you and we need to be able to make a case to you as why you should hand over money to get our journalism as opposed to getting journalism from places that aren't going to charge you anything, at least not in a transparent way. I think we can do that. I think there are ways to do that. I think the New York Times is currently doing it, but we have to do it. And my hope is that on the one hand, that will work. And on the other hand, that the mechanism by which it will work is better journalism for you.
That's all the time we've got. Thank you, everyone.